Thanks, Frank.
Thanks so much, Adam, and hello, everyone. Hello out there. That is a great program. I hope if you have clients or you're interested in that program, please do that. And I also just want to make a plug for a program Adam and I are going to be starting, which is hosting board meetings with Berkeley. And so if you're thinking about hosting a board meeting, please get in touch with us. We'd be happy to start partnering with you in that way. And I'm just so thrilled to be here. I want to echo Stephen Davidoff-Solomon's comments from this morning. We're really happy to be in person with all of you and to be furthering this partnership with Cooley and all of our sponsors. So thanks so much. So Eliot, Maureen, are you out there? All right, come on. We get to redo this. In February of 2000, we had a great conversation as Eliot Brown and Maureen Farrell had been working on the book and reporting this story for a long time. And now it's done, and you all get copies, so we don't have to sell books to you, but I'm sure many of you have read this great reporting and such a great story. So welcome back to both of you, and I'm excited to have a half hour to be able to talk with you and to be able to focus. So here you go, those of you online. Great cover as well. And I wanted to talk to you about the governance aspects of the story, and so dive in on the in terms of the board and governance. And so this is a very sophisticated crowd, many of whom have already read the book and followed your reporting and stories. So tell us about governance at this company and how it evolved over time from just 3 people who, well, give us the whole soup to nuts story about how the board started and how it evolved. We'll talk about that for a little bit.
Sure. So yeah, governance is one of my favorite topics here, and typically it turns out that when you're like going on TV for 5 minutes to talk about the book, people don't really want to hear that much about corporate governance. So appreciate the question. So the WeWork started in 2010 as this really tiny thing where it was just Adam Newman, the CEO, and his co-founder, Miguel McKelvey, and they kind of gradually started to raise money, and they turned to VC, and like they hadn't formed a board until then. And so from the first VC that came in, the really renowned one, Benchmark, they formed a board with Adam, the VC from Benchmark, and then a third investor from Roan Capital. And from the beginning, at that point, Adam controlled the whole thing because he had a majority of the equity. And I think one of the interesting things about WeWork that really sets sort of the stage for a lot of what's going on in startup land today is as it expanded and as the market got hotter, he was able to each step along the way get more power, even though he was getting more money. So it took, I think, until 2014 or 2015 that he introduced, in a funding round when WeWork was really hot, he introduced Class B shares, where he would get 10 votes per share and everyone else got 1. And that sort of set the stage for the kind of mania that followed and insanity that followed in the next few years. And so there were a lot of things that we can talk about. I mean, they ended up taking out money. They ended up, Adam took out a lot of money. They did all these kind of crazy acquisitions that made no sense, like a wave pool company, they bought jets. Then as the IPO, it sort of ratcheted up and up and up. And it was just like this total dumpster fire by the end, and that's one of the things that brought them down right before the 2019 attempted IPO, when basically the world read this S1 that was out there for the world and saw this company loses a ton of money. It has a wacky way of talking about its business, and no one really understands what that is. And also, the CEO is leasing properties to himself, and took out a $500 million loan and restructured the entire company so he could have a better tax benefit treatment on his stock options. That's a rambling, 50,000-foot view on the governance. But
No, it's not rambling at all. It's actually a great way of encapsulating the whole thing. And I'd love to get a little bit of focus for people here who are involved in startups or represent startups for the lessons about the early stage. So both of you covered this company for a while, but you really covered him from from an early stage as a real estate company. Were there any governance takeaways from that early period of time up through the Series B that strike you as being, you'd like to tell this group about?
Yeah, so even then, one of the things we learned in the, before he had, he still owned over 50% of the company, but he didn't have voting shares, and it was just sort of a normal company. He was taking out money, and in the Series A, it was $1 million, I think, between the two co-founders. Does that seem right?
Sounds about right.
And then in the Series B, they took out $9 million. And so what the directors, we gather, that's become in vogue today, but in 2011, that was really aberrant. So the directors at the time, and this was sort of a portent of what would happen, their thinking was, yeah, he really seems to be insecure about not having enough money. His wife comes from money, and so he needs to sort of provide. And if we just give him this, it'll settle him down. And so, they did it in 2011 at the Series A, and then the Series B, it gets to be a much bigger number. They're like, okay, well, this will settle him down. And I think that sort of phrase probably just came back in their heads over the next, 6 years until nothing did, and the market settled it down.
And so, Maureen, when you started reporting on the We story, were there governance aspects to the story that hit you right away, or did it take a while, hit you immediately?
I would say immediately. I mean, when we were working together, it was a lot later as it was getting closer to the IPO, and SoftBank was in. But I mean, I'll just say one of the bigger stories we wrote the summer before the IPO was supposed to happen. This was in the summer of 2019. I wound up speaking to someone who was close to an investor in the company who basically said, you need to look into this. I've never seen any corporate governance challenges like this one. Adam Neumann has taken out $1 billion from this company. It's insane. I look at all different startups. I've never seen things like this happen before. So Eliot had heard numbers of that. We'd sort of heard things, but this seemed very definitive. So we kind of dove into this and found out, we got some pushback. We ultimately wrote that between stock sales and loans, it was over $700 million. It turned out it actually was over $1 billion once we were able to see that when the S1 came out. But I think just that alone just opened the door, just how bad it was. And we wrote this story, and it was just, we were kind of surprised, I think, because we thought it was even more. We were kind of bummed to scale it back when we thought it was $1 billion, but $700 million. And the reaction to this story, people were just so horrified. It got just a flurry of inbound emails, and it just caused such a stir. So just those stock sales alone and loans, and then obviously the S1 came out, and it was unbelievable. But I would say, just to Eliot's point, it was just this runaway train, and I think something that struck us continuously while writing the book and reporting it was just the lack of power that the board, you had these titans of business. It wasn't a weak board. Ultimately it was an all-male board, and that obviously became, they raised a lot of questions when the S1 came out. But these were high-level, sophisticated people, and they were scared of Adam Neumann from the very beginning. We have a line in our book, Bruce Dunleavy, a venture capitalist with Benchmark, who had been on all sorts of boards, a very sophisticated, really successful investor. He said to Adam, absolute power corrupts absolutely. I don't think you should get these super voting shares. But Benchmark had given them to so many other companies that they were invested in. So Adam was like, how could you possibly tell me I can't get them? And
Yeah, I think the reporting in the book on the board is fascinating. And I went back through the book. So I have my dog-eared pages here for those of you who want to go back through it a second time, sort of with governance in mind. And there's this big chunk where the board really doesn't change all that much in terms of their view, their power, their persuasion, including a lot of the incidents that you just described. But then it switches, right? And so can you just talk through why this big chunk of it doesn't really have any dramatic changes, some conversations, but then finally the board says, no, this is too much. So that's not the way boards typically are envisioned to work. So can you talk us through that big chunk and what was happening then?
Yeah, I think generally the thing that sums it up is the board saw themselves as advisors, not directors. And that's, it's something you hear a lot in startup land, and so they'd say, why would I vote against Adam? I'll fight him in the boardroom, which you get varying reports on whether they actually did that. But then at the end of the day, when it comes up for a vote, do you want to buy a $63 million jet? All of the directors say they're against it, but then they all vote in favor of it, right? So our question is sort of like, well, if you were all against it, and you all voted against it, then it would fail. And so then Adam had this ability to, sort of technicality was, he could have blown up the board and expanded it and put more seats. He had the legal right to do that, but that's a lot to do over a plane. So the short version is they were sitting there watching Adam buy a wave pool company, and then they told him, we don't really think that's a good idea, and then he did it anyway, and then do these pretty ridiculous acquisitions that all ended up selling for fractions. They bought meetup.com for $120 million and things like that. And they're sort of just sitting there watching the numbers get worse and worse, and generally they would apparently push back, but they would not vote against him because they just didn't see that as part of their jobs. And I think, maybe you can talk about this, the SoftBank entering into the board also changed that dynamic a little.
That was definitely the case. In SoftBank, then there was a sense that throughout that they would go to the public markets. I mean, the board would say this, members of the board to each other. They're saying, the public markets will clean up this company, and Adam Neumann will be more, won't do the things he's been doing if he has to answer to public shareholders, which is kind of crazy. But so there's a sense that they would go public earlier. SoftBank came in, gave them billions upon billions, so there was not a need, pushed, I guess, 2 more years before they had to go public. But I think that was just a crazy idea and wild to just hear again and again. It's you have the power to at least, you're acting like you don't have any power, and then it's going to be all cleaned up in the public markets. And there are questions around, there's been a lot of questions around greed with Adam Neumann, obviously, just the money he had taken out, all sorts of things like that. But it's almost when you think about the board, there was this exit that a lot of people were going to get if you just get to the public markets, and almost felt just a passing of the buck of responsibility in so many different ways, but particularly with the board.
It also, Adam, we wrote a lot about Adam's conflicts toward the end. Adam was, whether intentional or not, gave the board conflicts, so that 2 of the directors had business with WeWork. So one of them, his private equity fund, this is Roan Capital, was given a JV with WeWork to make a real estate fund. And so suddenly he, was set up for this thing that at least WeWork envisioned as raising tens of billions of dollars. And that translates to a lot of fees and a huge amount of carry if they actually are profitable. And so, he's suddenly much more invested. And then Adam wants to make his own fund, and so then he just gives the Roan director an extra $35 million of stock or something like that as an apparent consolation prize. Another director had business. It was something like 4 of the directors at one point had kids working at WeWork. Which is not. And then another had what did we call him in the book? A friend, close personal friend working at WeWork. So there was a lot of, and some of these people, for some of them, it was actually really surprising. It's really, you thought you would be smarter than to allow that to happen. Bruce Dunleavy being one of them. His daughter worked there. It was kind of conflicts all around.
And so for people who are thinking about a charismatic CEO now, are there lessons mostly about psychology and understanding the sort of dominance of personality, or are they more kind of nuts and bolts lessons about conflicts of interest where you should just sort of keep in mind how this might be perceived later down the line? Sort of what are the lessons in terms of the combination of psychology and psychological lessons versus just, okay, as a matter of thinking about conflicts of interest and trying to understand how this is going to be perceived later on, that's independent of the psychological thing. What lessons are there in terms of those two areas?
It's a great framing of the question, because I think it was like the director's, his charisma, the psychology of it, he couldn't be taken away from that. I think they were all smart people. There were tons of red flags. It almost seems like, yeah, he just outmaneuvered them, and the psychology, the charisma, just kind of like overwhelmed people, whether it was the board or investors. And it's an interesting moment in time right now to think about that, like what the lessons learned will be. Because for as much as we thought when this IPO was called off in 2019 that the whole market had changed and we were in this different world and suddenly people cared about profitability and were scared of red flags, I mean, the pendulum has swung back, I mean, arguably to a more extreme point than we were at in 2019 before this company went public. So what I think Adam played on people's fears of missing out, like the whole FOMO idea, like if you're not going to let me do this, there's 10 other investors lined up behind you who are dying to come into this company, so you're just going to miss out. And I think that, I mean, a savvy CEO, I mean, you have to be very strong, I think, to stand up to that, and we're even in that more of that, like a more extreme climate than we were 2 years ago.
Yeah, my view, and I wrote a story recently that sort of put some of this into place in my head on all of these founders before CEO getting these enormous pay packages. And Adam got the same thing, and at the time we thought it was really kind of crazy, and now it's become the norm. And I think one of the lessons we learned is a lot of this really was a market, a product of just the market, right? Like it was simply Adam, there was a thing we found really funny where he already had 10 votes per share before the IPO. It was like 30% of the company, and then before the IPO, he wants to increase it to 20 votes per share. And people are like, why do you even need to do that? You already have control. He's like, I want, the Peloton CEO has 20. What am I going to have, 10? And so I was like, oh, that's crazy. And then you look today, and you can see some of the same stuff going on. And with the pay stuff, that my sense is from talking to people, the lawyers who've worked on this and others, is that the CEOs, they don't really need to be incentivized by an extra $1 billion if they already have 10 and they own 30% of the company, but they don't like a pure CEO having a better package than them. It's like, well, he owns 20% and he can get an extra 5%. Well, you, the board, don't think I'm that special? And so that's a dynamic that makes it really kind of contagious because there was an example recently with Brex. The CEOs, the co-CEOs, each got an extra 3% of that company. As an award, they have to hit milestones, just because the board was being nice to them, I guess. And suddenly a VC told me, it's like, oh, well, a lot of my founders have come to me saying, I want the Brex package. So like this is quick, and this is like it's before it's even sort of publicly known.
Yeah, this is a fascinating question about to what extent our thinking about corporate governance should be responding not just to structural aspects of the setup, but to this kind of set of psychological questions and FOMO. So I wanted to ask you, we have a little bit more than 10 minutes left. I wanted to ask you some questions about what didn't make it into the book. There's so much that did make it into the book, right? All the booze and the drugs and all of that. And I didn't see too much linked to the board on that. So I don't know if there's anything, if the board was involved in any of those stories, if you want to share that. Or just in general, I thought I wanted to give you the opportunity. You've been so gracious with your time, and we've done a couple of these programs with you before. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to talk a little bit about what didn't make it into the book. If there's anything super juicy, just for the 1,000 or so of us who are watching right now to hear about.
Broadly speaking, some of the frustrations were, even with our book that we went well over our allotted word count, there was so much on the cutting room floor, as you say, and just things that we felt like were really interesting that would have slowed down the narrative. We did a good amount of reporting on Adam Newman's wife, and she was very relevant because she was retroactively named a co-founder. She built a school. We have a chapter on the school. But she just had a fascinating story, and it just got to, her role in the company and Adam and her backstory there was just a lot there that we had to just cut. It definitely dragged down the narrative. too much. I mean, we mentioned like she was friends with all these like celebrities and got Adam into Kabbalah and her Ashton Kutcher connections. I think we make some of those connections that he met her, and it sort of opened up this whole new world. And he was, he was savvy about putting all his connections together, including Hollywood at the very beginning. That was one piece. SoftBank, there's just more. I mean, obviously there are books, and there are more coming on SoftBank that you could very easily have your own book on that.
Here, I'll tell a surfing anecdote, and so you can tell, you can decide whether this is a symbol or just fun. This is from someone who saw it. Adam kind of cheated at surfing. So I guess in surfing, you paddle. You go out to the wave, like that's what you do in the sport, and unless it's in an absolutely enormous wave and it's too unsafe, and then you can go out on a jet ski, and they sort of like, you step off the jet ski and then you surf. Adam would do the jet ski, for small waves in Long Island. And as he put it to an employee, the way I surf, I don't have time to paddle. In Hawaii, where he would go, you're not allowed to have jet skis in this part of Hanalei Bay in Kauai. But he hired a bunch of these like sort of heavy hitter surfers on the local scene, and he said, just take me there. They were jet skiing around, and then it was apparently like, normally it was cool because these guys were essentially, high-powered lobbyists on the local scene and would tell the police that would come up on their own jet ski, like, we got it. But then it was a busy day, or it was bad, it was choppy, and so they were making a huge scene because when Adam surfs, it's like they have a drone pilot, sometimes 2 drones, a photographer, and like multiple surf instructors on jet skis. And so the police come and say, or whatever authorities say, like, you guys got to cut it out. And apparently Adam just threw a fit, saying, like, no, I need to be able to jet ski in the middle of this thing. So that's surfing. Another one, I guess this is relating to one thing that Maureen mentioned earlier. They repeatedly lied to us about how much money Adam took out of the company. And we mentioned this in passing in the book for the first half of it. So the first time I asked Adam, just sort of randomly in a meeting we had, like, I heard a rumor you took out over 100 million. And he's like, no, and sort of denies it. And then I was like, well, I heard it, like, I talked to somebody who saw some paper that said it was 35 million. He's like, no. And then a few days later, he buys, it's in the New York Post that he bought a $15 million house. And so I kind of scream at the PR person, and she's like, Adam would like to see you again. And I was like, oh, he's going to apologize and confirm it. And he apologized, like, I'm sorry if you had a misunderstanding, and then like tries to mislead me for the rest of the time. Then fast forward till 2019, and yeah, Maureen calls with the, like, we've heard you taken out over $1 billion, and they flat out deny it, that it was that high. And then it really was just, a few weeks later, and it became public knowledge. Like, it's just in the S1. It's like, really? Like, you really just like couldn't wait 3 weeks, or you just like, you had to lie.
And 700 million was like that much better. I don't know.
The surfing story reminds me of some of the early stories in the book, and you have so much great reporting diving into his background. Are there any lessons, as you were doing that piece of it, are there any lessons from the earlier parts of his life, maybe some of the previous businesses, that are the kinds of things that we all should be asking or inquiring about people that maybe are symbolic in the way? I know the surfing story is later, but there's some early stories that maybe are the kinds of things that people could have inquired about or asked about that would tell you something about what this person is like. Do you have any thoughts about that, or any lessons about what kinds of questions we should ask about charismatic leaders in advance to try to understand risk a little bit better?
I don't think there were any, like, when we look back at some of the crazier things in terms of just red flags from his earlier businesses, I don't remember anything so extreme jumping out as they did later. I mean, it's amazing on so many levels, and this is like a good and bad thing, I think, of the culture we're in now, is like he he had these ridiculous businesses like collapsible high heels and crawling, crawlers to have babies give them knee pads for when they're crawling. They never quite.
That business plan was never going to last for years, right?
The problem was the real total addressable market.
Right. That was a great phrase in the book. That was a nice little passage. Sorry. But it's the lesson, and you can't really tell. I remember you talking about what he was like when you first saw him, when you first met him.
I think he was, I like to say that there is a high correlation between people who are convicted fraudsters and people who you think will be convicted fraudsters. So it's like a square and a rectangle. The rectangle is a square, or the square is a rectangle, the rectangle is not necessarily a square. So I didn't get the absolute slimy vibe from him the first second we met, but it was just, this guy is a marketer. And personally, I think that's at least always intriguing as a journalist, because their skill is fundraising. How often are you good at fundraising and good at running a business, and you happen to be, have stumbled on a really fantastic business idea. They can happen in concert, and they do. It's just less likely. In a mania market, you would expect that the sort of fundraisers would rise to the top. And then with Adam, just in the super early days, I really remember the specifics because they weren't juicy enough to really track down and verify where they were hard. But there were a lot of people who just remember being felt a little swindled by Adam. Well, he owed me $200,000, and then he said, oh, no, I never agreed to that. And it was repeated. And so I think that is probably not, that was definitely a consistent theme throughout life. They were better at paying their bills when they had $10 billion from SoftBank, but yeah.
But then also I would just say, as a journalist, I think now, among a lot of red flags we look for, just from the beginning of him, it's not a real estate company, just trying to tell you, obsessing over the image of something. And obviously it was very calculated. There was a big differential between being a real estate company and a tech company in terms of the valuation and everything. But obsessing over that detail, trying to get the PR people to fight over it being a real estate company ever. There's things like that, just changing the truth of what.
And I remember seeing Adam, the way he would talk about things, it was so clear. He had this way of being we don't care about numbers, I'm just here about community. And then you could just tell he'd slip and be when we did the $5 billion valuation round, it's most people call it a Series D.
He was clearly very focused on
right.
Those numbers.
That's how valuation was just the scorecard, and that was just
and the name dropping. There was always name dropping.
Often Ashton Kutcher.
So 1 minute, the final question I have for you is the final question you must have asked in writing this book, which is how do you figure out where it ends? So just talk us through briefly how you decided how to close it, and obviously the story is continuing, and we'll both continue to read you with great eagerness about this and other topics, but just tell us how you decided to close it.
So the actual end was relatively clear. It was the rise and fall. So we basically ended it when Adam left the company, negotiated his exit package. But then, so the epilogue was what came after, and there were more negotiations with SoftBank. They became very fraught, but also just this new era that we were living in. And I would say it was at least 3 to 4 times we had to completely rewrite the epilogue, because first there was this broader wake-up call, and people woke up and were scared of companies like this, and then suddenly it was oh my God, these SPACs are coming, and suddenly no one cares about numbers or profits, or the pendulum has swung.
These days, we focused a lot on how investors cared about revenue and not losses. Now companies get $100 billion with no revenue.
Well, it's a fantastic story, fantastically told, and thank you for doing this again for us. We really appreciate it.
Thanks so much. We're happy to be back here.